The next thing is the all business schools require that you be interviewed as part of the admissions process. They can take all different types of forms. They can take the form of going into school and meeting with an admissions representative, meeting with a student at school, an alumni, or even phone interviews. And I've heard even some schools actually going to group interviews now. Who do you want to talk to? Well, I always suggest that the best chance of being admitted and the best chance of the best way to leverage the interview process is actually go to a school, and hopefully you'll hit someone who's on the admissions committee. And if they like you, you now have a mentor through the application process. It's a big advantage because that person will be voting on you, and if they have a personal impression of you, if that impression is good, once again, the chances of you being admitted are probably higher. The second choice I would have is actually going to school and being interviewed by a student. And why is that? It's because of one thing, because students who are chosen for to interview generally have some type of favored relationships with people in the admissions committee. So although it's not, you actually could have a semi-advocate through the interview, through the rest of the application process if somebody really likes you. But once again, it's not the same as actually being interviewed by someone who actually sits on the admissions board. The other types of interviews are phone interviews, and phone interviews basically done by people who are actually from the admissions committee, but because of the distance between where you are and where the school is, it makes it very difficult for you to get to the school or for the school to get to you. And so they actually do, and they call up you, and they actually talk on the phone for 30 minutes. And it's actually, I mean, if you're good at phone interviews, it's a great way of interviewing. But some people have problems really phone interviews. They really like to see face-to-face contact with people in order to really to perform their best. I really don't love phone interviews, but they're being used more and more. And it's just the nature of there being a lot more people, a lot more qualified candidates who apply to business school now than there are spaces available. So the last type of interview is the type of interview I like to avoid at all costs. It's the alumni interview. And the reason why is you don't know who you're really going to be getting. Alumni that come in all different ways, shapes, and forms. They can be extremely nice, or they can be extremely sort of aggressive. You really don't know. I've heard of horror stories and I've heard of wonder stories, but I've heard of more horror stories than wonder stories. So just because you don't know who you're getting, you're interrupting someone's life. They're not vested in you. They're not full-time employees. They're not current students. They're not as interested as sort of necessarily a person who's on admissions or a current student at a school is. And also, once again, you could be excuse me, you could be interrupting their day. They could have had a bad day and you're leaving them afterwards. I mean, a lot of things happen in life, and I just would rather stay away from that whole thing if possible. Okay, so what are they going to ask you? They're going to ask you basic interview questions. They're going to ask you who you are. Tell me about yourself. They're going to ask you questions. Walk me through your resume. They're going to ask you about your strengths and your weaknesses. They're going to ask you about major accomplishments and major failures in your life and what you've learned from them. They'll ask you maybe simple questions about what you've done for fun. They ask you a question that your passion is. But all these questions are there to see that you answer them correctly, that your thought patterns are coherent, and that you as a person have the personality that fits in really what the schools are looking for in candidates. So the interview is really the last hurdle in the admissions process. Usually most schools they pre-select who they interview. So if there are 100 candidates, they may take the interview, and then they may interview 25% of them, those people who applied, and of the 25%, they'll accept 50% of those, so the acceptance rate will be about 12%. On average, if you're granted an interview at a school, chances are you have between a third and, say, 35 or 45% of chance of being accepted. So once you're granted an interview, your chances of being accepted skyrocket. They go from basically from 10% to basically maybe 30% to 40%, so it's actually quite high. The last thing in the application process I want to talk about is problematic aspects. Really, don't turn. First of all, people over-explain themselves. If there's a lot of issues, you don't have to explain. Try not to explain them. If there are problematic aspects of candidacy, for instance, a bad grade or a bad semester or a bad year, a bad component of your GMAT, or currently being unemployed, you have to explain these things. If you don't, they assume the worst. There's a fine line between what to explain and what not to explain. And generally, if you have those problem grades or something that stands out, potentially could be misinterpreted, you generally explain it. A lot of people explain away a B or plus in a class, and that's really not a grade to explain away. It makes you look sort of bad, actually. It makes you look like you're overly worried about things. So I'll say you have to be very strategic about what you explain and what you don't explain. But once again, if there is a significant problematic aspect of your candidacy, you must explain it. Once again, don't go into great detail. Just explain it, the situation, explain what happened, and then move on